Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 3 of the Catholics Against Militarism podcast. Real quickly, I just wanted to welcome all of the new subscribers. Thank you so much for subscribing to the channel, and I hope you like what you find here. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus's first words are, "The time of fulfillment. This is the time of fulfillment. The kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel." The word that is used, the Greek word that is used for the English word repent is metanoia, which means change your mind. So I'm excited to introduce to you today a good friend of mine, someone who has experienced a dramatic change of mind in his life. His name is John Carmody, and he is the director of the Center for Christian Nonviolence, and he has been doing a lot of peace work for decades. But he was at one time an officer in the Marine Corps, and he earned a Purple Heart for his service in Vietnam. So John Carmody is here to talk to us today about his life, his change of mind, and his life experience. So thanks for being with us today, John. Thanks for joining us. John, where did you grow up, and how did you end up in the Marine Corps? Did you enlist, or were you drafted?
Well, I grew up in a small city in Endicott, New York. I was the second born of what was to become a family of 6 sisters and 1 brother. Both my father and mother initially worked for IBM originally, and now the arcane technical process of punch cards is way beyond us. So when my mother and father started working for IBM, they didn't have circuit boards with billions of possibilities as far as information is concerned. They just had punch cards, which were about 7 inches long and about 3 inches high, and they would punch little holes in them. They're about a millimeter wide and about 4 millimeter, well, actually about 4 inches tall. So mom's childbearing duties necessitated her leaving the corporate world and focusing on raising the family. Dad stayed with IBM and was selected to be part of a group that developed what is now known as the computer. He was part of the first group to enter IBM's computer programming division. As a young boy, for whatever reason, I had a penchant for playing military games and toys and watching war movies, and at some level started to think about the military. I became enamored with watching war movies, and at the same level started to think about the military. I was enamored to watch war movies, and at some level started to think about the military. I became enamored with the Marine Corps, and one day, without provocation, decided that this branch of the service was for me. So I meandered up north to Syracuse, New York, one day and officially signed in to become one of the few, the proud, and the brave. Then was off to Marine Corps Recruit Depot at Parris Island, South Carolina.
Wow, okay. I think that's a pretty common story of young men. It seems that there's just a part of a young man that wants to test his mettle and be challenged and grow and be strong. And so I think that's pretty typical of all men, probably in any age. And of course, the Marine Corps is always seen as being a super elite group of men with their strength and their courage. So I can understand why, you would have been attracted to that as a young boy. Did you grow up Catholic, or did you convert later in your life?
Actually, the family was always Catholic, and probably more so than some other families, because we were really tightly involved with activities that went on in the church. We went to Catholic grammar school. We went to Catholic high school. I fell in love with a woman, Linda, when I was a sophomore in high school. And I was on the basketball team, and of course she would always come to the games, and we had a fairly amorous relationship. My father didn't think that was quite the way he wanted me to turn. He was thinking that we were getting too serious. So before I knew it, he came to me one day and said, "John, would you like to go to prep school?" So that took care of that issue for him. So, within a month, I'm down in Spring Grove, Pennsylvania at St. Francis Prep, being tutored and mentored by Franciscan priests. And I just found that to be, it was great. I was on the football team, I was a leading scorer on the basketball team, and on and on and on. So I was just really happy with that. And then one day I got a call from him. He was actually born in the Scranton, Dunmore area. He said, there's a game up here, John, and I'm thinking about coming down to St. Francis, and I'm going to bring Linda with me so she can watch you play. So I was fainted, So, yeah, that's how that worked out. So, eventually, when you go through boot camp at Parris Island, that's probably one of the most traumatic events of your life. It's probably almost parallel to some things that happen in war, because those drill instructors are so vigorous and so really, really emboldened to make sure that you are the part of the few and the proud and the brave. And my drill instructor at Parris Island was certainly the epitome of that. So when he first came into the barracks, he was a staff sergeant. He says, "My name is Fal Pearson."
Wow.
The FAL was like an acronym that he had. So, they made you do crazy things. One day, the drill instructor, we had 3 of them. One day, one of the drill instructor was a little peeved at us because we didn't clean the barracks the way we should. So he made us clean the barracks with toothbrushes. And that's the kind of thing, the kind of discipline for some reason they think is important. And I think in some cases it is, because you learn how to follow orders, regardless of the fact whether you believe they're right or not. Certainly, if they're going to be egregious, then basically you don't want to participate. And that's the case, of things you do when you're in combat, as far as burning villages or destroying hooches, that kind of thing. So we'll talk about that as we go along. So there were 4 of us that really buddied up at Parris Island. And we decided that the drill instructor that we had when we got to Camp Lejeune, who was to do our combat training for us, wasn't quite the type of person that we thought would be a good platoon leader, platoon sergeant for us if perchance he was the one that went to Vietnam with us. In fact, we thought he was a wacko, and ultimately a liability, a disaster.
Oh, yeah.
So we found a major, as a fairly high-ranking officer, when we talked to him about this, and he goes, "We have a program here at Camp Lejeune, and the program is one that if you score on the IQ test at a certain level, then you're automatically available to go to Quantico, Virginia, and become second lieutenants." So there were 4 of us, we just had a marvelous time together there. And, we used to go into Washington, D.C. and just kind of go to the Marine Corps barracks there and watch the parades and things like that. So we became very, very, very close. And we were very sorry to hear at one point, I think it was shortly after we got back from Vietnam, at least when I got back, that one of the people that was with us, Jack Lawson, who was a fighter pilot, was shot down in Vietnam and killed. So that was really a big blow to Ray and Lou and myself.
Yeah.
It was a very, very unfortunate event because he was a top-class Marine pilot, and it was unfortunate that we didn't have a chance to stay together as the famous 4, we used to call ourselves.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. That's
so they started talking about having tattoos, and there was a little bit of dissension about that one. So Jack said, well, what we'll do is we'll make 3 dots and we'll put them right where the thumb meets the index finger, right in that little pocket. So the sergeants and the colonels won't be able to dig us for having tattoos, because there'll be these 4 little dots representing us. But we never did that. We didn't even
It's good. You might have gotten in trouble.
Yeah.
For sure. So you 4 were together in infantry or in officer training school at Camp Lejeune. And so
well, the officer training school was actually at Quantico, Virginia. So you go to, Camp Lejeune was basically the training that you go through after you get out of Parris Island.
Oh, for the
And you
infantry
can go
training.
to different, yeah, you can go to
Okay.
different branches. We just, because we passed that test, because I think we had to be at least 120. We all got at least that. And so we were automatically allowed to participate and become, second lieutenants in the Marine Corps.
Well, this is an important point, I think, because we're going to get to your change of mind and your change to Christian nonviolence. So it's important to keep in mind that John does not believe in nonviolence because he has a low IQ. This is not a belief for stupid people, right? So I think that's important.
That's a very important aside that you brought up there.
Yeah. Some people think, well, this person must be a fool, and that's understandable too. So eventually you were sent to Vietnam. Pretty soon after you became an officer, right?
Yeah, we got shipped over right away. There was no
Okay.
delay. After we got out of officer candidate school, we were transported to Vietnam.
So
And we landed in Da Nang, which is the primary air base, and still is today for U.S. military. So that's where we started out. And then basically we went up Route 1 to an area called the Leatherneck Square. Because it was called Leatherneck Square because there are 4 very important Marine bases up along the DMZ. And we spent a lot of our time in that particular area. And basically what we did was go out on missions, of different types. Most of them were, some of them were scouting missions, but some of them were truly full-size battalions going out into areas just in the lower part of one of the provinces, which is Quang Tri province. And the camaraderie that results if you are involved in a conflict, like if you're ambushed or if you're for example attacked by a larger force, the ability of people to stick together simply because some of that training that you had in boot camp and then in officer candidate school just allowed you to do just about anything that you could in order to preserve not only your life but the lives and I think it's the other thing that we used to worry about was the whole idea of someone being injured as far as brain damage is concerned and the type of issues that follow that particular kind of activity.
yeah. So that sounds like you were right in the heat of it. And I just wanted to point out, this was like 1967 to 1968, right?
Yeah,
and so that's like the height of the war.
Yeah.
And you were 23 years old.
Yes.
I think back to what I knew when I was 23 about the world and about myself, and it was very little. I mean, I still feel that way today. But that's so young to be over there leading these search and destroy missions. At the time, did you see any you had gone to high school with the Franciscan brothers and they had such an influence on you and you had been raised Catholic. Did you see any contradiction between your faith and this service that you were providing for your country?
Well, I really didn't. I didn't have that distinction at that point in time. In fact, I think that, for example, we would have Catholic chaplains, come to our base and have mass. And basically, the way that turned out was they would actually be the force generators for keeping people in the combat situation. I mean, there was absolutely no discretion regarding our ability to do what we had to do in order to so-called win the war. So there was no talk about, for example, the way some of the indigenous people in Vietnam were treated, some of the things that were done, as far as just their housing is concerned, and the vast majority of napalm strikes that were instituted in Vietnam were not really against primarily the enemy, but a lot of the people that were just plain old civilians that were being damaged by the onslaught of a napalm bomb or napalm bombs. So, it destroys houses. It's so hot, people melt, and you would think, at the homily during the Mass that he would say, gentlemen or Marines, I think that you really need to take care of what you're doing as far as the people of this country are concerned, because they're not part of the war. And they're being killed by the tens of thousands, with the napalm and with airstrikes, etc., bombs. And that was really something that stuck in my brain when I first went to Charlie McCarthy's. It was actually the first retreat I went to that he gave, and I was just baffled by his spirituality and how far apart being a military officer in the Marine Corps was from being part of the life of Jesus Christ. So that was a big turning point for me. And that's, what got me into actually becoming the director of the Center for Christian Nonviolence, because I realized how horrible war was and how dissonant it is from Christ and what Jesus tells us to do. So there are three irreducible dimensions that when you say agape, that's love, in Greek. So it's the willingness to suffer without the desire for retaliation, the willingness to serve without the desire for reciprocation, and the willingness to reconcile without the desire for domination. That's agape. And those three things get blown up as soon as you step into the battlefield. It doesn't happen. And so
I've never heard those three things before. I've never heard that explained before.
Yeah, that's the basis. When you say agape, that's what it means. It means all three of those things. All three of those things. You take one out and you lose some of the dominance or some of the ability of that to be a successful endeavor for you and for people that you're trying to keep from being violent or joining an organization that thrives on violence.
Just for our listeners, can you repeat those three things? And just for our listeners, the word agape is the Greek word in the Bible that Jesus uses for love, but it's not romantic love, and it's not a brotherly love like a friendship, but it means the love of God or unconditional love. And so the ultimate expression of that kind of unconditional love is Jesus on the cross saying, "Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do." So the ultimate willing to suffer all the way until death for the sake of love. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about agape. And what were the three dimensions of it, John?
The willingness to suffer without the desire for retaliation, the willingness to serve without the desire for reciprocation, and the willingness to reconcile without the desire for domination. So you reconcile with someone, you don't try to dominate, that particular relationship. It's reconciling without that desire. That's the big part of it. It's just the desire. It's not that you don't do it sometimes, but that's really important. And so you have Jesus on the cross, the willingness to suffer without the desire for retaliation, the willingness to serve without the desire for reciprocation, all that he went through as far as, being denigrated, as far as being, a missionary of what we think to be the Holy Spirit.
Right.
And so you tell that to most people and they just okay, their eyes kind of pop up, and the willingness to suffer without the desire for retaliation. Come on, give me a break. That's the Marine Corps, isn't it? It was just so contradictory, what you do in the service and what you do as far as wars are concerned, but you can't control them. The number of napalm strikes in Vietnam that never even came close to the enemy, but trashed entire villages and sometimes hamlets just simply by those planes coming in, dropping napalm or dropping cluster bombs. Yeah, it was, and the fact, that Charlie talks about, I talk about, about the priests not even wanting to even broach that particular perspective because people just think it's nuts.
And they always have, right? I mean, in the Bible it says that Jesus was a scandal to the Jews, and that he was a scandal because he was a suffering Messiah. He was not a military, powerful Messiah who's going to deliver them politically, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But the thing is that spirituality, it's not what you have, it's not what, what kind of wealth you have, it's not your position in society. So if someone slaps you on the face, the thing is that, if I was if we were in Washington, D.C., and some guys come down, they always made fun of us second lieutenants, if we had our uniforms on. And, they used to harangue us. So we were thinking like, okay, what if we get in a fight? And Jack said, no. He said, we don't get in fights. We just go the other way. And so it's like turning the other cheek, but he was really talking about the butt, get out of here. We don't even want to begin that. So it was really good. Some of the discipline was really, for us four, it was just automatically bonding for whatever reason. I think we had a lot of the same emotional, and to some extent, spiritual ways of looking at life.
Yeah, and I hear that a lot about men who serve in the military together. There are these friendships and bonds that are formed, and it is in many ways very transformative. In some ways good, I think, and in some ways bad. But yeah, I hear that a lot. Going back real quick to when you first got home from the war, I know that at that time that was like the height of the anti-war protests, and we hear these stories about soldiers being called baby killers and all these terrible names by the anti-war crowd who wanted peace but were not acting out of a peaceful spirit themselves. They were very, very unsympathetic to the soldiers, many of whom had been drafted and didn't even want to go in the first place, but felt that they had to. Did you experience any of that kind of hostility from people from the peace crowd when you got back?
Well, I didn't experience the hostility because I actually was one of the people that participated in the demonstrations.
Oh.
So that was kind of contradictory, that here you are, and these people are, trying to denigrate you for participating in the war. But here you are, and you know what the war is. And so as a result of that, then you have this understanding that they don't really understand what was going on there, and how someone can actually be transformed as an individual. For a Catholic, for example, that basically was an altar boy, from 6th grade up into high school, because in the St. Francis Prep, I was an altar boy there. So you have this, religious background, and now you're immersed in a demonstration in Washington, D.C., and these people are just haranguing, people that were part of the Vietnam War. And the thing that I would think about there is that you're right, you're right to be incensed by the fact that we had a war in Vietnam, and we had such horrible consequences as far as not only the structure of the country itself and the hamlets, but also the people. The burns and the scalding and the deprivation as far as food is concerned was just immeasurable.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of like, you don't, the thing that I made sure that I didn't get involved with as far as those were concerned is we didn't participate in the, when they got violent and aggressive, so if it was a non-violent kind of thing, then we would kind of, go along with that, because we probably had harder and stronger feelings about the war if you were in the right stage of spiritual consciousness, than otherwise.
So even though at the time when you were the Catholic chaplains were not mentioning anything about the war, they were supporting you and encouraging you in what you were doing, and you didn't quite feel like it was against your faith. It sounds like when you got back, you just knew, your conscience was telling you that this war was wrong. And so you joined the anti-war demonstrations?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I didn't do it every weekend, but, I went down for several of them, 3 or 4 of them. Some of them were getting a little bit raucous. So, it became to some extent dangerous because they didn't know what you had been through, and you didn't know that you were really kind of on their side.
Mm-hmm. And did you feel like, I know that at the time we didn't really have this term of post-traumatic stress disorder, but I know that a lot of veterans who came back from, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, did experience that, and it had great effect on their life. Do you feel like you suffered from that at all?
No, I didn't. And I think that one of the things that is responsible for that is the way that you conducted yourself in the war itself. So, you called in airstrikes, you called in, I can remember that we were basically surrounded by an NVA force, and we called in airstrikes, and the airstrikes came in and they dropped napalm bombs, and we just cheered, and we don't, and later on, in retrospect, you say, gee, these bodies get burned to the bone, and there are people around them. There are water buffalo, there are animals, there are goats, there are chickens, there are young children, there are hooches, et cetera, et cetera. So all that goes, just to maybe knock off 15 or 20 or 40 NVA. So yeah, that really wears on you, and it's a very, very difficult thing to overcome. But the realization is that you had one state of mind in that particular instance, and you were basically wanting to save your life, and you didn't have the wherewithal to rationalize a way around that. So do we call in airstrikes, which are very, very devastating, especially when they're napalm, or do you call in, another force, for example, helicopter gunships, which aren't so devastating and basically don't usually become involved in those kind of napalm strikes that the jets do. So, there's a lot of room for you having PTSD. So I think that one of the reasons why I didn't have PTSD when I got back was the way I was processing, what was going on as far as the Vietnamese people were concerned, and the infrastructure of Vietnam too, because you have to realize that they all have to rebuild those homes now. They have to buy new animals. They have to, there are some groups that went through hamlets in a particular area of Vietnam, and they would burn all the grain. They would burn all the food. The one particular case was the My Lai massacre, where there are hundreds of people that were massacred by a unit, an army unit, as a result of being frustrated by the fact that intelligence told them that there was an elite North Vietnamese army force in that particular village. So they got to the village and they found out that that particular intelligence was totally off. So out of frustration, they started to kill the people of the My Lai hamlet. And some of the things that were done were unbelievable. One of the most unbelievable was that they would put bayonets on, not everyone, no, but it happened, there was enough that it was made a big issue of. They would put the bayonet on the end of their M16 rifle, and they would go to the mother with a young baby, and they would throw the baby up in the air and try to catch the baby on the bayonet of that rifle. That's how much insanity existed in that war. And so if someone goes home and they're thinking, they're looking up in the sky and they're seeing a baby falling down and landing on a bayonet, what are they going to be doing? There's no rational reason for doing that. It was just like they could do it, so they did it. And Lieutenant Calley was, the person in charge of that group, and you'd think that, he had some sense in his head that he wouldn't do that. And there was a young kid that was in the ditch. They just lined everyone in the village up in the ditch, and then they went from one end of the ditch to the other and shot them. Everyone in the ditch got shot. And there was this little kid that came out of the ditch, and he was covered with blood. Okay, and Lieutenant Calley told one of his men to get the kid. Okay, and this guy wouldn't do it. He wouldn't shoot the kid. So, some of the officers in the Army had carbines. They weren't the M16 or the M14, et cetera. So it's a very short gun, but it's a, rapid race of fire. So Calley shot at the kid and blew his head off. And this was things that people would do, and if I did that and 10 years later, I had a flashback, I'd have PTSD, if not long before that. So there was this unbridled brutality as far as the war was concerned. And it was just horrible. And I think about it, I think about it a lot that, there's a napalm run and I'm thinking, wow, that's great. We got those suckers, but, they're people. Some of them are kids, some of them are women, some of them are grandparents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So war is not, it's not an isolated thing. It's a broad swath of violence and torture and maiming and brutalizing and amputating and just, it's a sick process.
I think so too, and I think back then our country had a press that was allowed to show this to the American people and report on these atrocities. And I believe that now the government has learned its lesson, and they know that when you allow people to see war for what it is, they will turn against it. So now we don't have this kind of Life magazine kind of journalism. We have embedded journalists who can go over into these wars, and it's a very controlled process of what's allowed to come back and be shown to us. So sometimes I worry that we're becoming very disconnected from the reality of war, and we can't see it anymore because our journalists aren't allowed to really go over and report on it like they could back in Vietnam. Well, it sounds like a really
well, there was a lot of press suppression there too. But there were some wonderful reporters over there that captured, the essence of what was going on, and were brave enough to report it and catalog it and write books about it. Yeah. So that was there's a lot of books out there that, people have written, and they show that the atrocities that were experienced by the people of Vietnam are just horrible. And even worse sometimes with NVA. You capture an NVA soldier and, there's big time torture. Of course, they did the same thing, to our troops, when they were captured. And like John McCain, he's up in Hanoi, in this horrible state as far as the prison is concerned. Mm-hmm. So, it's and then you have Donald Trump, denigrating John McCain,
Right.
It's unfathomable, the level of ignorance as far as knowing what military people go through. And if someone is taken to a foreign country like Hanoi, or a foreign city like Hanoi, and then is tortured for months and months, that's really something that, if the way he overcame that and the life he led after that, was really truly remarkable.
Yeah, I can't imagine anything worse. I really can't, and that should never be denigrated in any way. I was just real quick. I was trying to search on my phone. There was because I know a lot of people say that, oh, the massacre of My Lai, that was exaggerated by people. That kind of thing was very rare. That wasn't typical. But there was a book that came out a few years ago. I can't remember the name now, but his whole point was that massacres like My Lai were actually very common. They were just part and parcel of the war. Do you think that they were fairly common, or were they just kind of these outstanding incidents that rarely happened?
I think that was something that was beyond the pale. I mean, that's not something that you saw, day in and day out. That was a rare event.
Okay.
And they tried to suppress it. They tried to suppress some of the soldiers that wanted to talk about it. So it got suppressed for a fairly long period of time, and then you have someone going in and they do the whole spiel on what happened, in My Lai, and they realize that, all these people that were in the village basically were put in ditches, along each side of the road as far as you could see, and then they just walked down those ditches and with their guns, with their M16s or whatever they were using. They have one called a grenade launcher that can fire an explosive round, that goes boom, and then they have another round that has little tiny darts in it. They're flechettes, they're about maybe 2.5 inches, maybe 3 inches, some of them. But instead of having buckshot come out or having an explosion come out, you have these little arrows that once they hit the skin, they just travel up the bone. So if you have 14 of those stuck in your arm, some of them are going to just stick in, and then some of them are going to go up. And to get them out, you have to do all kinds of surgery just to get the guy back you know, and this was a poor Vietnamese peasant
Yeah.
that had no recourse, absolutely no recourse.
Yeah, that sounds horrible. Um, so John, I know you got a Purple Heart when you were serving. A Purple Heart is for heroism in war, right?
Well, it's actually for getting hit.
Oh, it is for getting hit. Oh,
If you get wounded, you get a Purple Heart. You know, I had two of them, right?
you had two. Okay.
Yeah, I had two of them. First one I had was we went almost as a battalion-sized group out into the upper part of what was called Leatherneck Square as a battalion. So you have lots of people there. You may have maybe 300 or 400. And so the idea is to go out into this area, a large area, because you have a large number of people, and you want to basically make some kind of insight into what's going on as far as their military capabilities were concerned. But the primary reason to go there is to kill as many as you can. So that's the mission, is to kill as many as you can. So what happened to me in that particular occasion was that we had a battalion, and so there you have hundreds of Marines, you know, in this great big huge circle, and you have your command post in the middle, and you have some of your artillery in that circle, and you have mortars and things like that you're going to use to protect yourself should you get assaulted. So the thing that was supposed to happen was that if you were in the perimeter, it's a huge perimeter because you got a lot of people, right? But you're almost right up against the jungle. Okay. So what happened was that we went out on patrol and we came back on patrol. You know, we didn't make any contact. We just saw, you know, a couple NVA soldiers or Vietnamese run across, you know, a pasture that we happened to be looking at, and you know, couple of people fired off a few rounds, and that was it. But we went back, and what happened was that where we left out, there were supposed to be people that closed up that gap so we don't get overrun as a result of not having the proper reinforcement at that particular part of the line. So as soon as we got back, I had a machine gun team go up right almost to the edge of the jungle at that point in time. And probably, I don't know, maybe 15 minutes after we got back, it started to rain artillery rounds. So the NVA were just watching us, watching. And then they found out basically where we were, and there was a lot of us. And so they just started throwing in artillery and mortar rounds, and so what happened was at this line, you know, where you're right up against the jungle almost. I mean, because you know you're in your foxhole, and I'm back. You know, I may be back 50 meters from there, and so I'm kind of seeing what's going on, and then all of a sudden there was fire coming from the jungle. You know. AK-47s just pelleting the periphery, and there was a great big Marine corporal who had the machine gun. I mean, this guy was just big, and you know, he started firing off rounds, you know, to keep them back, and you know, he got shot. Okay, so that was the first casualty in my platoon that, you know, I had to write home to his wife to tell her what happened. And you know, that was a really hard thing to do. It took a while for me to get over that. But in the process, you know, seeing what's happening up there, I had my M16, okay? We were some of the first troops in Vietnam to get the M16. And this rifle turned out to be somewhat of a dud. You know, you could fire off 6 or 7 rounds out of your magazine, all of a sudden it would jam. And so I ran up with my M16, right? And I fired, I don't know how many rounds it was, but it wasn't enough, right? So I threw down the M16. I took out my pistol, you know, the pistol that you carry, the 45 that you carry when you're a lieutenant. And I had 2 magazines of bullet rounds in the jungle utility of my right leg, okay? So I run up and I start firing away with my 45, and basically other people on either side of us started to realize what was going on, and so basically they were able to push that enemy force back. So here I am running back, to my foxhole, my safety hole, and I get hit in the shoulder, right, with a round. And, they had to call in a medevac helicopter to get me out. So when they brought the helicopter in, everyone's familiar with the Huey, that little thing that looks like a little tadpole, that flies across the sky. So there's a lot of those in Vietnam. There's also the Sikorsky, okay, which has a big body, for taking people that need to get to a hospital out of harm's way. And so the helicopter, and basically, I think if I point to the ceiling, it's 10 feet high or about that high, that's where the pilot is sitting. So everything underneath, right, is for someone that needs to be stretchered out and taken to one of the military hospitals. So what happened was that NVA soldier had a rocket propelled grenade, and he hit I'm running to the helicopter because I want to go to the hospital, right? But what happened was that RPG hit the helicopter and blew it up. So within minutes, the thing was just flames. And I don't know how the two pilots got out, but they jumped out the side, and the helicopter didn't blow up, and they didn't get burned, and we were all safe. But we had to stay overnight on a wet, cold, damp day, waiting for some relief to come in so we could get medevaced out. So it took me probably 12 or 14 hours before I got medevaced out, but it wasn't really a serious wound. But I ended up in a hospital in Japan as part of that medevaced out. So
wow, yeah. That's crazy. I just can't even believe that you lived through that. And I'm very happy that you did. So wait, you're telling me that was your first wound, and then you had to go back and get wounded?
That was the right. So they call them majors. If you have a major wound, basically, if you have two majors, you basically don't need to go back into a combat zone. So that's what happened to me, because the next event was even worse. The next event was, we were in Dong Ha, and our base was just outside of Dong Ha, which is where PeaceTrees Vietnam is today. It's an incredible organization that is cleaning up the unexploded ordnance that exists in Quang Tri province. And not too long ago, a rapporteur from the UN came and asked the person who actually founded PeaceTrees Vietnam how long it would take to clean up Quang Tri province from all the unexploded ordnance that was sitting in the ground in Quang Tri province.
Wait, John, real quick, what is ordnance? Is that just like
ordnance is like bombs, okay?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's anything that is destined to make someone hurt, right?
Okay.
Not die, right?
So a lot of them would get dropped, and then they just sat there. They didn't explode, but they're still alive, and they can still.
Yeah, they are, and there was a lot of them alive, and he said 100 years, 100 years. So if part of the documentation I have, I can send that to you. You can send it out to people. But if you look at what they've done in the time they've been there, is the number of. I have some of those stats here somewhere. Here it is. One example of PeaceTrees impact: 1,256 acres of land cleared. 110,636 unexploded ordnance removed and destroyed. 99,425 individual received mine risk education. So they're educating the people of Quang Tri province and they're really good because they're extremely well trained to look for this ordnance without getting blown up themselves. 1,797 students attending kindergarten. 215 victims and 62 families affected by accidents supported, 1,905 scholarships distributed, 15 kindergartens, 12 libraries, 2 community centers, and 100 family homes built, 43,850 trees planted by 809 citizen diplomats. And I went back after I got back from Vietnam and spent a week with them doing that.
Wow, how
I just planted trees. I didn't mess with unexploded ordnance because I wasn't about to go there.
Not for a third time, no. Oh, so you spent a week. When was that? When was that you went back to help with that?
I think that was 2002.
Wow. So, I mean, the war ended in what, 75 or something? 74?
Yeah.
So,
I'm
yeah.
not sure about when they finally called it off, but I was out of there, so I didn't pay attention to that.
So about 30
Yeah,
years
but that-
later, people are
yeah.
still working to clean up what was left behind from the war. Were you there with other veterans or other Americans, or is it an international group?
Yeah,
or?
there was another fellow there from where was he from? Let's see it.
Another veteran?
Oh, Joachim, yeah, Joachim Eckel, right. What a guy, right? He was a former Marine lieutenant, so he came, he was there at the same time I was.
Good for him.
And what we wanted to do was we wanted to go to our base, to where we were when we were in Vietnam, along the DMZ. So we asked, if we could do that, to go to the base. And the guy that was responsible for us, so to speak, said, no way, you can't do that. So for the next 2 days, Joachim every morning got our handler and schmoozed him drinking coffee. Okay. On the third day, he said, oh yeah, go on out there, have at it. So we went out, right? And then we saw our base. Okay.
Really?
Which is when we left, it was red clay because it was totally defoliated. Okay. And they defoliated me. I had Agent Orange dropped on me. I mean, they're just letting it comes down and it gets wet, and you're standing there, walking there, and you get doused with a shower of Agent Orange, right? Now, if the composition of Agent Orange is no more than the same thing you put on your lawn to kill your dandelions, okay? There are a couple molecules in there that cause weeds to die, okay? No one knew that there was an unidentified toxin in the Agent Orange. In fact, 2 years ago, I took a course in nutrition science at Cornell University, and the person that put on the program was T. Colin Campbell. And he is a scientist who actually discovered dioxin. At that point in history, it was the most toxic element on the face of the earth. And this is what was raining on us, okay? And he said it takes about maybe 30 years before the effects of that particular toxin manifest themselves as cancer. So about that amount of time afterwards, I was diagnosed with lymphoma and leukemia. So there's another thing, you have to watch out for when you're in a war. You have some invisible kind of mist, that's coming down, and basically they call the Agent Orange because it was different colors. It depended on it was Agent Green. If it was a green barrel, it was Agent Red. If it was a red arrow, it was Agent Orange. If it was an orange barrel, basically that was all that was about. But what happened was there were a lot of people that were affected by the exposure to Agent Orange, and I'm just a classic example of that. I happened to get a hold of a oncologist that was brilliant.
Good.
At that point in history, they had discovered that you could actually target, certain processes in the body that were responsible for, part of the leukemia lymphoma. And So what they had done was they had discovered some antibodies that would, if you gave them, IV, they would find their way, to these cancerous cells, and they would bind to the membrane of these cancerous cells, and they would kill those cancerous cells. So he said, this is what we're going to do. This is immunotherapy. I mean, we're just getting started with this, so we're thinking it's pretty good. And he said, in addition, though, you'll have chemotherapy. We just can't depend totally on the immunotherapy because we don't know how much it will actually induce literally the obliteration of the cancer. So,
well, that's good. God bless.
Yeah, so
God bless the doctors who heal people. That's awesome.
So anyway, I went through my therapy and had to come back and have a CT scan every once in a while, or an MRI. CT scan primarily, but I think MRI too. But I don't have to have those anymore because I've been free for 12 years.
Yay! That's awesome. That's great news. And so I know that you're a super healthy guy, and we don't have time to get into veganism today, but you're a vegan now, right? Maybe that has something to do with it.
Oh, yeah. I took that course from Colin Campbell, and there is no doubt about it. That's a #1 destroyer of the environment. There's nothing that puts more CO2 in the air and contamination on the ground than animal agriculture. It's really amazing.
I can believe that.
As soon as I heard that, I mean, I was a vegetarian, and then I went vegan because basically it's whole food, plant-based. And there was a student that raised their hand and said, "Hey, what about the meat? And what about the dairy? What about the cheese? What about this? What about that?" And Colin Campbell said, "Have you ever seen a silverback gorilla?" And the kid says, "Well, yeah." And well, how about a giraffe? And yeah, of course. And then the kid in the back said, "Well, how about an elephant?"
Plant-based. Right?
Campbell said, have you ever seen a gorilla, eat anything but whole foods, plant-based? That's what they do 100% of the time. There may be a few carnivores in those areas, but generally every elephant, every giraffe, every rhinoceros, all those big animals, right? And even the cattle, they have all kinds of grain, all kinds of mixtures. Yeah. But they have to have a lot of grain, and it takes up a lot of land, and it's really quite something. Anyway, we won't.
Well, that's great. I'm so glad that you kicked it and you survived. That's amazing. But John, as you're talking, I'm just thinking, they built the wall for Vietnam. I don't know what year they did that. But it seems like to me it was a little premature, because if you consider the casualties from that war, from, like you were talking about, the exposure to Agent Orange, the people who died later of cancer, not to mention the soldiers who ended up committing suicide after they got home, there would be far more than 50,000 Americans that died from the Vietnam War. Don't you think? I mean,
I think
if you added up all of that, it would just be, I mean, it was horrendous as it was, but we're still paying the price today, I think.
I didn't know what their criteria was for being in the wall. I'm sure they had a criteria, but I'm sure that it wasn't certainly broad enough to include people like, for example, that had cancer, that had no oncologist to treat them.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, that's a big issue there too.
Yeah, that's a war casualty, and it just keeps going on through the years. It doesn't just end when we come home. Okay,
I had to have an MRI. Because I had a torn rotator cuff in one shoulder, and so they made the appointment for me, right, so they could check out my rotator cuff. And they said, "Do you have any metal in your body?" And I said, "Well, I know I have a couple here and there." And they said, "Well, here and there won't get it. We want to see it all."
Wow.
So they, because the MRI is, the magnetic field, and you're going to be pulling this. Yeah. So.
Oh, wow.
So they did a CT scan, and actually I think they decided because it was really small, but there are all kinds of little, holes in my different parts of my body, but it doesn't bother me at all. But that was just crazy. I think, wait a minute.
Wow, that is crazy.
Yeah. So it lives on, you'd be surprised. And that was just a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I'm sure it stays with you forever. But it seems like you took a lot of these experiences and what you learned, and you turned it into something else in your life. You did something else with your life. So how did you get interested in Christian nonviolence? What made you you're not just a peace activist, but you've actually been out there preaching the gospel of nonviolent love of friends and enemies, which even among Catholics is not always accepted. So how did you get into all of that? Well, first of all, you ended up getting married and having a family, right?
Yes. 3 kids. 3 children.
Kids.
They were like they were kids. 3 children, 3 adorable children, 1 boy and 2 girls.
And some grandchildren too, right?
And some grandchildren for sure.
That's great. Well, that's always good to hear. And I've heard your wife's voice on the phone. She sounds like a lovely lady. So after you got back, you got a biology degree, and you got a Master of Arts in Teaching in 1980. And then you retired from teaching and went to work for DuPont Pharmaceuticals and some pharmaceutical companies. And then during this time, you ended up attending a conference that was being led by Father McCarthy. Is that right?
Oh, yes.
And that was a turning point for you. It was a turning point.
That was my atomic bomb. McCarthy. He's just brilliant. And he's so.
What made you go to that conference? I mean,
I knew a guy, Charlie Schultz, right? From Johnson City, New York. Somehow I came in contact with him, and I don't remember what the initial contact was, but we kind of buddied up and went to certain things. And then he called me one day and he says, "Hey, John, they got this guy coming to St. James for a retreat. His name is Father McCarthy, and he's supposed to be really good." I said, "Okay, Charlie, another Charlie won't hurt me." Anyway, so I went to it. And from that point on, it was like, okay, it was like T. Colin Campbell saying, whole foods, plant-based diet, or you're going to kill the planet and yourself in the process. Or, you live the life of Jesus, the nonviolent love of friends and enemies, and basically you'll live forever. So, I got 2 big things there. I got Campbell and his incredible research. They sent him to, he did the China study. It's probably when New York Times did the review on that, they said it was the most comprehensive book on dietary intervention on diet, period, that they've ever seen. It's the clinical, it's the course, it's the book now, this China study, because one of the higher ups in China wanted someone to do a study of the health of people in these outlying villages and how healthy they were, what they were eating, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he did that, and the book turned out to be the China study. So it's, it's probably 600 pages, but it's a really good read if you want.
Yeah. So you've had
anyway, they were just enthralled with him. And then there was someone in India that wanted him to come and take a look at the kids because they had liver cancer. Okay. So he took this trip to India. I forget where it was. And he was looking at the kids, and looking at the severe problems they were having, and couldn't figure out what was going on. So peanuts were the primary protein that they were using in India at the time. And, they were asking him about, what's good about peanuts. And of course, he said, it's a good staple food, but, we certainly need other things, to make a full diet or make a complete nutritional diet.
Yeah.
So he was watching the peanuts come in, from the peanut plantations, and they were coming into 2 belts. One goes this way and one goes that way. Okay. The one that went this way had peanuts that were just really nice, the color they should have been, the size they should have been. There were no disparities as far as that particular, line of peanuts was concerned. So he was looking at the other peanuts. They were not going to the middle class and the wealthy. They were going to the poor, downtrodden people. They were getting those peanuts, and the kids were eating the peanuts, and it caused liver cancer.
Oh, wow.
He definitively was able to describe the role of this particular species of fungus that would cause the cancer itself, the liver cancer. So this is corporate capitalism at its worst, right? Give them the junk. You guys can have the good stuff.
Yeah, wow, that's pretty, that's malicious. Okay, so once you went to Charlie's retreat, you decided to start getting more involved in like preaching peace. I mean, a lot of people attend retreats and it makes them think about things, and they go home and they just go back to their regular life. But it sounds like you felt really called to work with Charlie. Father McCarthy, we call him Charlie because he's our friend, but you wanted to work with him. So you started the Center for Christian Nonviolence.
Uh-huh.
Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you do with the center and what it's all about?
Yeah, well, the number of things that we do at the center have to do with, for example, one is setting up retreats to begin with, and the other is to make his materials available. So we basically have pamphlets, we have books, we have actually 2 books on Amazon.com right now. One of them is I think the first one that he did, and that was All Things Flee Thee, for Thou Fleest Me, a cry to the churches and their people to turn to the nonviolent Jesus. That's a long title. So I can hold it up here if you want to see it. You're familiar with it, right?
What, in episode 1, I actually interviewed Charlie about both of those books.
Okay. Yeah. And the other one is Christian Just War Theory. Okay. So the church has a Christian Just War Theory, and then Charlie has a colon after that. And the rest of it is the logic of deceit, because it's deceit at the level that the churches handle it. They're deceiving people when they say that they can go into war and still be loving Jesus or loving as Jesus would love.
And that's a strange thing for a lot of us to hear, because we just grow up in this culture thinking it's I always thought, it's wrong to kill, but it's okay to kill in war. That was my only moral understanding of killing in war. So once again, those books are really, really good for those of you who are interested in that. And so you've also haven't you been doing a little bit of work with like University of Birmingham, or helping at some colleges?
Yeah, University of Alabama at Birmingham. That's that's a outlier of the University of Alabama, the one in Birmingham. So there were 2 people that got in touch with me, Jerry and Sis Levin. Jerry Levin was the USA Today head of their press service in Lebanon. Okay, so this is Jerry Levin. Okay,
I'm writing his name down because I want to interview him too.
Oh yeah, I can send you their stuff. They have one that they have a book, but they also have a DVD, and I can send you that.
Great.
That's very important. And so what happened was that, so he's in Lebanon, and of course, it was not a stable country at the time. So one day he was just hauled off and put in a room and shackled, and basically Sis had no idea where he was, or how long he was gone, or what happened to him. So she had some connections, and she finally got in touch with a person who thought that they knew where he was, or knew someone that realized that this reporter now was being held captive somewhere, and he was. And basically, long story short, was that someone actually allowed, I think it was a bunch of sheets, to get put in the area, this little tight room that he was in. I think there might have been normal bedding. I don't know, but I don't know the detail on that one. I have to go back and read the book. But anyway, Jerry takes these sheets and blankets and ties them together and shimmies out the window, right?
What? Oh my gosh.
So
Sounds like a cartoon or something.
no, it was. I mean, well, Jerry's something else. I mean, in those days, he was just so good. He was so brave and so wild, about getting things done. Not wild in the sense that he's somehow mentally deranged, but he had a purpose, and he always, seemed to somehow live up to that. So anyway, he sensed when he got out of the building and he started to run across the street, and he thought he heard the sound of boots coming up the road. So he dove underneath a vehicle that was on the side of the road, and before he knew it, there was a bayonet poked in his face. So he was thinking, oh, what the next word should be, and
yeah.
So they got him out. They said, get out, get up here. And he said, we have to take you somewhere. And Sis Levin had contacted someone to actually set that up, that she knew would be able to pull off something like that.
And that was his wife?
That was Jerry's wife.
I'm going to have to get this whole story. That sounds amazing. Yeah, but
yeah, I have a couple of their books. They have the one small one, which is really the pivotal story, but they also have a DVD.
And he had some kind of conversion experience when he was being held.
Oh yeah, when he was in Lebanon, I think. But there's something else in there too. So
wow. So they were somehow connected with hooking you up with University of Alabama.
Oh yeah, Sis listened to some of my talks that I gave at the University of Alabama in Birmingham, and basically what happened was that we would go there at least a couple times a year, and they had a peace studies course. So I was the first lecturer for the peace studies course, and basically what I talked about was, because I was almost done with my neuroscience degree. I think I had like 8 courses, and I had to do a doctoral study, but with 3 kids, and all the time and effort you need in order to do that. Basically, I had all the core courses, like 7 or 8 neuroscience courses, and so I took it to nonviolence, and basically the program that I set up for them was the neuroscience of nonviolence, and this was a group of kids that was like the elite kids, the smart ones that they wanted them to hear that. So they had this like great big auditorium with the scaled seats and everything, and I did it for a long time.
Wow, that's great. So you're going to come back on a different episode and tell us about the neuroscience of nonviolence. But I knew that if I invited you to talk about that the first time, we would never be able to cover your life story and your personal conversion of your heart and neuroscience of nonviolence at the same time, because your life is just so fascinating. So we figured for this episode, we'll cover John. Who is John? What's his life experience? And then next time you come back, we'll talk about the brain. And I'm really interested in hearing what you are going to teach us about that. We should probably wrap up here pretty soon. Do you have any advice for young men and women in the military, or who are thinking about going into the military, or veterans who have been through war? Do you have any words of wisdom to share?
Something comes to my mind almost immediately. I remember reading that, after you posed that to me. And I think that, for me in general, being somewhat partial to the Marine Corps. Anyway, do you remember the movie Tom Cruise did, Born on the 4th of July? Because you see him on the street, with his parents, and you see all this, flags and, band and nationalism, et cetera, et cetera. And if someone watches that and goes through it as he did and sees what the end is, then they really have to think seriously about the possibility that that could be them with not much effort, simply because of circumstances that they are involved in because of the process of being in the military and actually having to kill people and watch people die and watch heads be shattered and watch hearts being blown out of their chest, you know, with a RPG round, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you can only take so much of that, you know, and then when you start thinking about it, that's sometimes where the PTSD comes in, post-traumatic stress disorder. So, yeah, it's, but there are a lot of other things you could do. I think one of the things they could do is to read Charlie's book. You know, if they have any kind of spiritual affiliation, that if you read that book, you're going to get it, period.
Oh, The Logic of
Deceit. It's a wonderful book. Yeah.
Yeah, Christian Just War Theory, The Logic of Deceit.
Yeah.
And it's real short. It's not expensive on Amazon. It's real short, and it's very plain writing. You can read it in a few hours, I think.
It is, and it's very well written, and it's cogent in the sense that things meld together, and you can see the big picture by the time you get done. How what's going on with this Christian Just War Theory is really something that nothing is going on with, because no one really teaches it. And Charlie teaches nonviolence, just like Colin Campbell teaches whole food, plant-based. You know, we're not going to be eating meat, we're not going to be doing dairy, we're not going to be doing right, because of the tremendous damage that it does to the environment. So that's another thing that people just don't even want to listen to, but they know. And if you look at a chart, you know, a scientific chart that shows about where all this CO2 and methane are coming from, you find out that a lot of it's coming from animal agriculture, when in fact some of the products that are in animal agriculture, like steaks and things like that, bacon, there's all kinds of harmful chemicals that have gotten into the ecosystem. And this is basically, you know, what's part of your diet now, and no one can predict. Even organic food, they say organic steak, organic this is no different. Basically, they can't sort that out because what's in the air, what's in the water.
Okay, so for episode 2, you'll come back and talk about the neuroscience of nonviolence, and then maybe for the 3rd episode, we'll interview you on your diet and why you eat the way you do. That might be interesting too.
All right.
John, are you open to being contacted by people who might watch this and want to reach out to you or talk to you?
Yeah.
How would they do that? Through this?
I think the best thing is the cell phone number.
Oh, let's not put that online.
Let's not do that. All right. Well, let's do the home phone number.
Let's not do that. I'm worried that we just don't want to put it out there. Is there like a contact on the Center for Christian Nonviolence website, like an email?
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, we'll set something up for that.
Okay, or you can contact me if you want to contact John. I have his phone number, and it's contact@catholicsagainstmilitarism.com. So just email me. My name is Ellen, and I will put you in touch with John. Do you still do speaking engagements, or do you still do presentations at colleges or anything like that?
I haven't done that for a while.
Okay.
So I think that when I talked to Sis the last time, we might be reinstituting that program that we had at the University of Alabama at Birmingham.
Okay. Well, we'll at least get you back to do a presentation on this podcast. And yeah, thank you for your service, John, and for everything you've done for peace.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for sharing your life experience and your wisdom with us. It's been really, really great. We look forward to having you on again.
All right.
All right. Take care. God bless.
God bless.